and welcome to 2 days after the end of May for the final video of Star Wars month. It got a little bit delayed, I do apologise. So last Star Wars month, as in 2016, we had a look at Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, and I defended it against some of its harsher criticism. And I figured what better way to cap off 2017 Star Wars month than doing the same for Attack of the Clones. So let's get on with it. Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones is, in my opinion, probably the most inconsistent of all of the Star Wars films. It manages to have, both simultaneously, some of the best scenes in all of the Star Wars saga, while also having some of the worst. It has some of the series' most clever plot choices, but also some of the weakest, some of the best character development, and also some really strange, out-of-character decisions. And what is probably the most notable and notorious is some of the most compelling dialogue in all of Star Wars, contrasted rather harshly with what is some of the worst dialogue in possibly any cinema. In this video, I'm not here to blindly say that Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones is the best movie ever made, but instead defend it against some of its harsher criticism and explain why I still thoroughly enjoy it and still consider it to be a positive contribution to the Star Wars saga. So, firstly, we might as well start by tackling one of the main criticisms that seems to permeate throughout the entirety of the prequel trilogy. I am, of course, referring to the abundance of politics and the abundance of political debate. The prequel trilogy is essentially the story of the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the destruction of the Republic leading to the rise of the Empire. And as I said in my video defending the Phantom Menace, without showing the Republic actually functioning, it falling and becoming the Empire would have had absolutely no impact. I won't go into that reasoning in too much depth here because I've already done so in the Phantom Menace's video, and I won't go into too much detail on the political side of Attack of the Clones either because I feel like that's probably worth an entire video in itself. But, in brief, we see Chancellor Palpatine essentially establishing himself as a dictator. This role is of course not cemented until Episode 3 where he proclaims himself Emperor, but his power play for emergency powers to be given to him, having confronted the galaxy with 2 Phantom Forces, was nothing short of brilliant. We saw his plan being set up in Episode 1, where his manufactured conflict on Naboo saw the previous Chancellor removed through a vote of no confidence and his being subsequently elected, and now we see a similar play put into motion to create a manufactured war in order to install upon him wartime power. This progression from Episode 1 into Episode 2, which set up and was continued on fantastically in Episode 3, was, I found, extremely interesting and is one of my favourite parts of the entire prequel trilogy. As I said, I could probably do an entire 10-minute video on this and may well do so in the future, but since this video is supposed to be more broadly talking about Episode 2, I think it's probably about time to move on to the second point. Which doesn't actually move on all that far because it's in regards to the clones, which is somewhat tied into politics. I think most people agree that the Grand Army of the Republic is pretty flipping badass. And so I don't really need to do a great deal to defend them because, I mean, come on. Although I have heard arguments claiming that their introduction doesn't really make a great deal of sense. This disagreement often comes from the idea that the Republic would probably ask a lot more questions about where the actual clone army came from and why it was already grown and ready to be dispatched at a moment's notice. I'm not sure that these questions really concern me that much, because as we already know, a lot of the Republic is very corrupt and under the pay of Palpatine, and also possibly even more of the Republic is in the Outer Rim and therefore under threat by the Separatist uprising. Further, I doubt many people in the Republic would actually question as to why the clone army was grown. We, the viewer, know that there's some suspicion there, because we actually know that it was grown for the Republic, but they themselves aren't aware that it was grown for the Republic which didn't yet need it, and they therefore have no reason to question it. All that most of the Republic government would be aware of is that there's a sudden threat of war from the Separatists, and therefore in response Palpatine promises to build a Grand Army of the Republic. Where does he get this army from? Well, a planet that supposedly specializes in building clone armies. That seems to be the basis of their entire economy. Is it therefore suspicious that a planet whose entire economy seems to be based upon building and selling clone armies had a clone army built ready to be sold? No, I don't think so. But what about those who did know that there was something a little bit weird about the appearance of the clone army, namely the Jedi? Well, the decision to use the clones was not made unilaterally by them. In fact, they probably had no input at all and it was probably entirely the Chancellor's choice, but I do agree that they're not looking into it further, and seemingly not even addressing it until pretty late in the Clone Wars series was certainly a strange decision for the Jedi and one of the weaker points of the story. It's not the only time the Jedi rush headlong into a situation without really planning it out because of their hatred for the Sith, so in reality it's not entirely out of character. And I suppose once the war had started, they really had no decision but to use the clones, but I do definitely think there should have been at least a scene in which the Jedi were questioning the use of the clones. Moving on to the more general storyline of Attack of the Clones, I think the story itself is actually pretty good, but it could have probably been told a little bit better and a little bit more clearly. For instance, one of the things people criticize when talking about the film is the bizarrely convoluted attempt of assassinating Padme. Namely, why put poisonous centipedes through her window when, if you're at her window, you don't just shoot through it? Personally, I think the answer is that it's because they didn't actually want Padme dead, because Palpatine wanted Anakin to be with Padme as it's part of the steps along the journey of his corruption. They just wanted Padme to be no longer on Coruscant, because she was leading the vote opposing the construction of a Republic army. And it is also further conceivable that Jango Fett was used to take out the shape-shifting assassin and purposely be seen so Obi-Wan would be able to trace it through the bounty hunter himself and the poisonous dart in order that they would become known to the Senate and so therefore be able to be utilized in the beginning of the Clone Wars. And indeed, it does seem that this is how we're supposed to interpret the series of events, because at the end of the movie, we're told that war breaking out is all part of Palpatine's plan. However, if this was indeed the intention, it could have definitely been laid out a little bit less convoluted for the audience, and also the trail that Obi-Wan tracked could have been definitely less coincidental. I mean, if Palpatine was indeed laying down breadcrumbs to lead Obi-Wan to Kamino and then subsequently to Geonosis, a main piece of evidence to figure it out should not have hinged on the fact that Obi-Wan just happened to know Dax, who just happened to know about Kamino weaponry, and also, going back a little bit further, it should have also not depended on the fact that Obi-Wan just happened to jump out of the window after the drone. And I think this is a pretty consistent issue throughout all of Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. There's a lot of really cool ideas behind the story and plot, it's just that they're unfortunately not executed to their full potential. Speaking of which, the Anakin and Padme arc, their romantic subplot, and the beginning of Anakin's descent into darkness. I have said on multiple occasions that the worst thing about Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones is the unbelievable and pretty terribly done love plot between Anakin and Padme. And I still stand by that to a degree. I mean, it's really weirdly done. Anakin acts like a total creeper, then there's a weird exchange between them about sand, there's a line about wishing he could wish, and then suddenly they're apparently in love. It is really quite terribly done, however, the actual concept of Anakin and Padme falling in love is not the issue. The execution was terrible, but once again, the actual idea behind it was really good. Pretty much, Anakin's entire descent into darkness across the three films is alluded to and summed up by Yoda in Episode 1 in the meeting between Anakin and the Jedi Council. During that meeting in Star Wars Episode 1, we're told that Anakin fears losing his mother, that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering, which is a pathway to the dark side. And this unhindered warning is echoed in Star Wars Episode 2 when Anakin does in fact lose his mother, slaughters the Sand People, and even admits to hating them, and further echoes the warning in Episode 1 with the dialogue from Yoda telling Mace Windu that he senses suffering and that Anakin's in terrible pain. However, rather than learning from this hard-taught lesson, Anakin further distances himself from the teaching of the Jedi. Instead of learning to now distance himself from emotional attachment, he goes on to marry Padme, and instead of accepting that death is a natural part of life, he goes on to vow that he will become powerful enough to even stop death. This perfectly sets up for when in Episode 3 he's faced with Padme's loss, and in attempting to prevent it, his descent into darkness becomes complete. It's just unfortunate that some of the setup for this in Episode 2, mainly the romantic subplot, wasn't exactly done perfectly. It's another instance where the idea was great, just on execution it felt kind of flat. Moving straight along to the graphical department, once again even I have been a rather large critic of some of the graphics in Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. And indeed, in some of the areas the quality is definitely lacking. And on a somewhat related note, I always found it really annoying that in Star Wars Episode 2, unlike in Episode 1 and 3, the droidicars have no shields. I've always tried to rationalize it to myself that they've just been rushed off the production line and into battle, but there is that cynical voice inside my head that thinks they, as in the movie makers, simply forgot to put them in. However, that said, the giant battle between the Clone Army and the Separatist Army towards the end of the film is one of my favourite battle scenes in the entire Star Wars franchise, and it is almost entirely CGI, and still to this day it looks absolutely breathtaking. The scope and atmosphere in this battle is absolutely fantastic, and once again is more evidence towards my earlier statement that the movie is just extremely inconsistent. I know that most Star Wars fans have a bit of a phobia towards the word special edition, but if they ever do decide to do a special edition of the prequels and clean up some of the CGI with more advanced techniques now available, I think it would probably be pretty well received. I think that's most of the major points that I wanted to make made, but I will briefly talk about the things that don't really fit into any category, but I still think warrant addressing. Firstly, there are definitely some things in this film that don't really make a great deal of sense. For instance, why didn't the shape-shifting assassin shoot Obi-Wan instead of the probe droid? And if it's because she didn't want to kill Obi-Wan, then why later in the bar did she sneak up behind him with a gun rather than just leaving? On the more positive side of things, I really liked how when the clone army was getting the upper hand on Geonosis, we have a bit of a throwback to the Phantom Menace from when the Federation army was invading Naboo, where in episode 2 we have Poggle the Lesser reporting that they've lost communications as a sort of poetic echoing showing the tides have turned since episode 1. Back onto the negative side, I thought there was some seriously bad pacing issues, with both the speeded chase scene and the scene in the droid factory being excellent examples. Either scene went far too long and didn't really add anything to the plot that a scene 1/3 of the length could not achieve. Once again swaying over to the positive side, I enjoyed them showing Anakin's early pondering over the idea of an authoritarian dictatorship being a good thing, and even his joking around about aggressive negotiations. In the context of this one film they seem harmless, but retrospectively considering its future, they become kind of horrific and foreboding. And finally, I really enjoyed seeing Yoda fight. I know a lot of people consider this to be a negative in the film, but I thoroughly enjoyed it and thought the idea of this little nimble thing spinning around with a blade that can easily slice your leg off was sort of terrifying. I could probably go on forever picking this movie apart scene for scene and saying which parts I liked, which parts I didn't like, but I think at this point I've probably gotten the point across. There were many things I thought this film did fantastically, and many things I think this film could have done far better. Overall though, specifically for the development it gave to Anakin Skywalker, the political side to the continuation of Palpatine's rise to power, and the kick-ass large-scale battle scenes on Geonosis, I still consider this film to be a positive addition to the Star Wars saga. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Since the film does have such a divided opinion on it, I would love to hear what you thought about it in the comment section below. And, as always, until next time, I have been and still am Grim Grindle.
People don't always agree.
Well, then they should be made to.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
Well, if it works.
It's a joke. When you give me that look, it's a joke.